Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Salam and welcome to another conversation. We call these Tabadlab Live. We try to engage with people that really know what they're talking about. And today, we're really lucky to have Shashank Joshi. Shashank is the defense editor at The Economist. He and the magazine tend to be the last word in whatever they're talking about. And recently, Shashank has written the cover story for the 30th of January edition of The Economist. And I believe the story is titled Nuclear, I want to get this right, Nuclear Proliferation is not fast, but it is frightening. Shashank, thanks for joining us, and great sort of really big picture, long arc story. Tell us a little bit about how you wrote the piece, because I think the writing process is one of the most fascinating things about the content that we end up reading.
Musharraf, thanks very much for having me. First of all, it's great to be with you, and thanks for the kind words of introduction. So here's the piece. I have a copy on my desk. Well, look, normally for these things, you would go travel, you would go talk to people, you would take the pulse of, people in Tokyo and Seoul and Riyadh and in other places and say, what are you thinking? What's the government thinking? What's happening behind the scenes? And of course, we can't do that. So this piece, like pretty much all the pieces I've written in the last several months, was reported from my desk, sitting here talking on Zoom to people, lots of people, dozens and dozens of people in different countries, trying to get a sense of what the debates are like in these places. But I accept you only penetrate skin deep when you do that. So I'm eagerly awaiting the day when I can get on a plane and hang out in a bar or coffee house somewhere in Taipei and get the mood of a Taiwanese diplomat as to what they're thinking about their nuclear program.
Yeah, and hopefully we get to run into each other on a plane again, like we did. I think probably among the last trips that I was on was the one where we crossed paths a little bit. Look, Shashank, the stories, I think, given that you haven't traveled for this, I think it's incredibly rich and nuanced and detailed. And in a sense, what I drew from it was that you've identified two broad regions that represent the threat of proliferation now and for the foreseeable future. When we talk about foreseeable future, how foreseeable? Like, the Iran story has been ongoing now for, I would argue, the better part of 2 decades, yeah, in terms of really a serious threat. And I don't really see any reason why we would assume that it would stop in the next 2 decades. So talk a little bit about what you might have gleaned in terms of the time horizon of these threats and the actualization or the likelihood of actualization of both these regions and the threats that they represent.
You're right. These are very long, slow-burning processes, not just because the technical requirements are difficult, but the diplomacy and the politics is very constraining. And let me just say a word of introduction to all of this. When we think about proliferation, many people will think, well, okay, first of all, people who have experience of the 80s and 90s may think of South Asia, India, Pakistan, from a Western perspective, at least. I know that Pakistanis and Indians would typically not conceive of their own programs as proliferation, but of course, that's the language that was used. But they're not proliferation issues, right? These are fait accompli, these are settled, established nuclear programs that are mature in their own ways. The other one was, of course, you'd think of these kind of small, hostile states from a US perspective, right? You think of Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, you think of Bashar Assad's Syria. Those proliferation issues were kind of taken off the table in various ways, some clean, some extremely messy and convoluted. Saddam Hussein's program was really quashed by the 90s, even if the US didn't realize it. The Syrian program was bombed by the Israelis in 2007. The Libyan program was traded, perhaps very unwisely from the perspective of the Libyan regime back in the early noughties in a deal with the Americans. So we thought of proliferating states as the other people, the bad guys, right? These are the states we don't like, the Saddam Husseins, the Gaddafis. And the argument of the piece is the appetite for nuclear weapons, or the appetite to at least explore nuclear weapons and explore the possibility of nuclear weapons for the next 10, 15, 20 years, may be more interesting and more simmering under the surface, at least, and occasionally bubbling up in some cases as I explore, in East Asia, among US allies, notably Japan and South Korea, and to some extent Taiwan, all of whom had secret nuclear programs during the Cold War at one time or another, right? Many people don't know that, but they all explored nuclear programs in decades past. And in the Middle East, of course, Iran is a decades-old story, as you note, one whose future is, I think, kind of being settled now under this administration, and we can discuss that. But that has created, I think, inevitable proliferation pressures, appetite to explore nuclear pathways in Saudi Arabia, which of course has the money to do it, it has the resources to do it, it has the motivation to do it, the legitimate security concerns, just as Iran has, and also in Turkey, where we have seen Turkey's president openly talk about the unfairness of nuclear weapons in the last few years. So the argument is these states are not going to get nuclear weapons in the next 2 or 3 years. It's that the demand is there, the appetite is there, and we may see various kinds of hedging. And to give you just one example of that before I shut up and let you come back, look at South Korea. South Korea has recently said it will test a submarine-launched ballistic missile. Okay, how many countries do you know that don't have nuclear weapons have tested submarine-launched ballistic missiles? I can't think of any. Maybe there are some sort of missile wonks who will correct me, but there aren't any. And look, clearly this is part of long-term South Korean hedging to say, if North Korea goes down this path and its nuclear program grows, if China's nuclear program grows, if Japan thinks about this in the future, we, South Korea, are not going to sit back. You know, we're going to think about our options, and we're going to have the delivery systems to deal with this. And the fundamental difference with the last wave of proliferation pressures, you could say, is that these are mostly US allies. These are not the bad guys. These are not the other side. These are your friends. These are your partners. And that's a completely different challenge. I hope that made sense.
A lot of sense, and I think a brilliant sort of summation with sort of added, I mean, the added value of having you explain it, I think speaks for itself on screen. Listen, the one of the questions that emerges from all this is what this discourse and these emerging narratives in these locations or these regions, what implications they have for the way these countries are governed. Right. And I think the question for me starts with Iran, because in a sense, it's hard to imagine a revolutionary state, right? A state that is essentially sees itself as not only revolutionary, but also a guardian protector for, you know, a significant, not huge, but a significant population that is global, and whose support is in many ways also with a lot of thanks to, you know, the efforts, the public diplomacy efforts of the regime over the last, you know, 2, 3, 4 decades. But you have a state that essentially has no reason to ever really stop as long as the state is what it is. If there's a grand bargain or compact that fundamentally alters its strategic calculus, you can expect a change. But I don't see that. Similarly, North Korea, South Korea, unless there's a détente, and even that might not help, because as you mentioned, the issue might be more Japan and China, even if North Korea, South Korea stopped being an issue. You know, there was a time when it was said about Pakistan and India, you know, and India would say, listen, if you can get China to give it up, we'll give it up. And the Pakistanis said, look, the Indians say it's for China, but actually it's for us, and we're smaller. So the only way you're going to get us to give it up is demonstrable evidence that the Indians have stopped. Unless we were able to either change regional geopolitics or change how states see themselves, I don't see the hope for a slowdown. So if what you're arguing is that we're now seeing the seeds of the next generation of proliferation concerns, I guess the next question would be, what are the qualities that you see that will make it more or less likely? And you know, one question that comes up there is the nature of governance in those states. Are majoritarian populist leaders more likely to go down that path? Are fully functional democracies less likely? And it looks like, I mean, those are interesting, you know, juxtapositions, because you have a mix of all kinds of states in the list that you've prepared, right?
Absolutely right. All of the factors you mentioned are relevant. There's, of course, a flourishing literature on what causes proliferation, and academics don't always agree. You know, there's sort of endless debates on this subject. I think the key is the geopolitical aspect. You know, if you have big security threats, that underlies it. And of course, we don't need to get into why Iran would see that. It's obvious. We don't need to get into why Saudi Arabia would see it or why South Korea would see it. I think your point about domestic identity is very interesting, and it's a point at the end. I don't think it's necessarily that authoritarian leaders particularly want nukes more than others. I mean, you know, you know, it's true that when South Korea and Taiwan seriously pursued nuclear weapons in the Cold War, they were authoritarian regimes. But we saw, you know, democracies do this as well. I mean, Pakistan's you know, proliferation pressures occurred during periods of democracy and less than democracy. Similarly, in the case of you know, European countries, we see pretty good, solid democracies, you know, like Sweden, West Germany, others pursue these things as well. I think the thing about authoritarian leaders that's really interesting is that they typically have fewer checks on their authority, right? They can get away with stuff more easily. And let me give you an example of this. I was talking to a former Taiwanese defense minister, and I said, look, what is this debate like in the Taiwanese context? You know, is there a prospect of a Taiwanese bomb in the next 10 or 20 years? And his argument was that at the end of the day, no, not only is it too risky in terms of inviting Chinese invasion, but the issue is that there isn't an appetite among the Taiwanese public, right? As in Japan, there's a public that's firmly opposed to this. They would, you know, a free press would sniff it out, they would publish it, they would expose it, there would be an outcry, a government couldn't survive. Now, compare that to a country like Saudi Arabia, where if Mohammed bin Salman decides he wants a bomb, and whether that's through cooperation with Pakistan, whether that is through indigenous efforts at building an enrichment and reprocessing capability, who is going to stop him? What are the checks on his authority, right? They're external checks, the US breathing down his neck, his allies saying, if you do this, we'll sanction you, we'll withdraw protection from you. But the fact is, authoritarian leaders have simply fewer checks on their authority. And that is why when I look at Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and I look at Saudi Arabia and Turkey, it's Saudi Arabia that worries me in the longer run. Should Iran go down its current path and the JCPOA break down, it's the Saudi case that I think I worry about the most among that bucket of states.
I guess that, you know, that's a beautiful segue into essentially the same principal proliferation story and concern that we've had now, like I said earlier, for at least 2 decades. I think the experts some would argue longer than that. Which is it on? I think the centrality of preventing nukes in the hands of Tehran is informed as much by the threat that Tehran would represent being a revolutionary state as it is by the knock-on effects for proliferation appetites in the region. Is that not right?
I think that's true, but of course I'm sort of wary. I take a sort of more pragmatic view of Iran's intentions. Yes, it is a revolutionary state in one sense, but the degree to which it is revolutionary, the degree to which it actually wishes to foment revolution in its neighborhood and abroad, relative to the degree to which it's simply projecting power to create a kind of defensive buffer, like other states do as well. You know, like many states in the Middle East use militia organizations in this way. The reason I'm cautious here is because I think back, as many people have done, to the Chinese case when China was acquiring nuclear weapons in the 1950s under the Mao regime. Mao's China was seen as a radical, revolutionary, wild-eyed state that was willing to kill millions of people at home in collectivization and forced labor and through sort of various labor camps. And a regime that kills millions of people at home will surely be willing to kill millions of people abroad. It's not rational, And I saw this again in H.R. McMaster, the former U.S. National Security Advisor, describing North Korea as irrational and therefore as a kind of state with which you couldn't practice deterrence. If someone's irrational, you can't deter them because the cost-benefit calculus doesn't apply. For me, that's very dangerous logic. Even if you think that Iran is a geopolitically revolutionary and ambitious state, I kind of come back to this idea that it is still rational. It can still be deterred. You can still have a kind of deterrent relationship with it. And I'm wary of kind of imagining that their deterrent calculus is too wildly different to everyone else's.
So if that's the case, then doesn't that water down some of the rigor? Well, not so much the rigor, perhaps the vigor of our concerns, in the sense that if acquisition costs are high and these countries are willing to bear those costs and come out on the other side with this capability, and we're assuming that there's a certain internal engine that the capability creates, which in and of itself is a deterrent. Then I guess the question is, why is this so important? The JCPOA as one example, the NPT sort of, I guess, negotiations as another example. Why is this issue so important that it found the cover of The Economist?
Well, it's important because even if you agree that deterrence is possible with most countries, first of all, that's not the end of the story. As we know, there's something called the stability-instability paradox, which is the idea that when two states have, if they both have nuclear weapons and they have both deterred each other at the strategic level, neither is going to mount a huge conventional attack or a nuclear attack on the other side, in a way that perversely frees up the states to use subconventional attacks on each other, right? Because you're shielded. The other side is not going to attack you. Now, this is an argument that we've heard most prominently from the Indian side towards Pakistan, right, in the last 30 years, to say the stability-instability paradox means because Pakistan has a robust, sound nuclear shield, we feel that it's able to mount other types of attacks more effectively. And that argument is applied in many cases. The South Koreans will feel it towards North Korea. The Saudis will feel it towards Iran. So even if you think deterrence works fantastically well, there's still a concern. But the other reason is this. The history of nuclear proliferation is a story of relative success, right? The way I begin the piece is to say back in the 60s, I think 63, President Kennedy is giving a speech and he says, look, I think that in 10 or 15 years' time, there could be 25 nuclear states. That didn't happen. There are 9 nuclear states, and the number actually went down. Belarus, Kazakhstan, Ukraine gave theirs up. South Africa dismantled its nuclear weapons. Proliferation has been kept at astonishingly low levels. Yes, India, Pakistan, Israel, of course, have broken out outside of the NPT, North Korea within the NPT, but pretty limited levels. So the worry is that you could still see a kind of reversal of that historic trend. I think that's part of the concern. And of course, not everyone agrees with me that you could have a stable deterrent relationship. If you're sitting in Tel Aviv and you're sitting there watching the Iranian regime, look at some of the things they say about Jews and Zionists, I think, one can understand why there are different perspectives and views in those places. I think you're on mute, Musharraf. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. It's interesting. You say, people who disagree. We're treating you as the absolute authority right now, at least. So we're going to take.
My job, really, as I treat it now, is to kind of talk to experts, talk to different people, get a sense of the debates, get a sense of the different views. And I'll be the first to admit, let me say there are people who disagree and say maybe my piece and the arguments I'm making are a little bit too alarmist. Actually, as you pointed out, Iran has been latent for decades. Saudi Arabia could be latent for decades. South Korea, has been pursuing this since the Cold War. So maybe we end up in a state where everyone is hedging. No one new acquires nuclear weapons. Everyone is just hedging for 30 years. When we're sort of old men, that this will still be the case. South Korea will have a whole suite of ballistic missiles, but nothing to put on them. I mean, that's perfectly possible. I'm certainly not suggesting I have the last word on this, or I think I'm dead on.
But obviously, Shashank, with President Biden coming in with, in many ways, kind of I think not just a U.S. mandate, but in many ways a global mandate. I think that he's, at least seen by me, as the last great hope for for what we had maybe anticipated as the great liberal order that was going to run the world for the rest of time in the late 90s, right? And we came out of 9/11 battered and bruised, and it really reshaped so much. And the Obama era, we came out with our optimism completely extinguished, and we've come out of the Trump era, I think, necessarily with this sense of expectation and anticipation that you know, being the great leader that he is, understanding the world in a way that maybe no U.S. president taking office has, certainly in our lifetimes and maybe much further back. The quantum and depth of his expertise and engagement with these issues, you know, is 40 plus years deep. So I guess that leads to the question, whether you're being too alarmist or not. Certainly the Biden administration would be entering and reading your piece and looking at the world right now with a great deal of trepidation. What is the likely sort of posture that the U.S. is going to take? You know, the easy one that we've talked about here at the Tabadlab as well is, you know, what's going to happen with JCPOA. I'd love to hear your views on that. But more widely, how do you think that long-term U.S. strategy will evolve with respect to these two regions? Maybe not so much focusing on individual countries, but what kind of a regional strategy? And there's a, you know, it's an easy question to answer, I guess, right? What kind of regional strategy is going to work in East Asia or in the GCC?
It's a great question, and you know, you're right. Almost as you said it, you fear for Biden, you know, coming in with those expectations among people like yourselves. And you're right, he's steeped in this. He's served on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for so long. He was talking about proliferation decades ago, and it was something that mattered to him while he was in the Senate. So he thinks about these issues, he knows about them. But he's also got a new generation of advisors, right? Jake Sullivan, his national security advisor, is very young, you know, an entirely different generation of official. And the team of people staffing the Pentagon and State Department that I'm seeing are a whole new generation of Asia hands with, you know, very, very different instincts, much more competitive when it comes to China, much more hard-edged, and with perhaps less of the education in multilateral issues like terrorism, non-proliferation, all of those kinds of things. Where do we begin? I mean,
just on that, I wanted to add a question there. Do you consider Kurt Campbell in that category, or more the traditional category? Because it feels like he's the one that's going to manage these issues with respect to China.
Yeah, and for those who don't know, we should say Kurt Campbell is sort of the Asia SAR, right? The Asia coordinator in the National Security Council, and there are a large number of other Asia hands as well. I mean, you know, I think he is not a kind of uber China hawk. So that's one thing to say, but nor is he sort of what many people from the outside would call a kind of soft engager, someone who's sort of really focused on repairing ties with China. I mean, he's probably closer to the competitive side of things, but he's a pragmatic figure, right? And I think he'll play a key role in brokering some of these debates. But the initial noises that I see coming out of the administration are clearly towards the competitive end of the spectrum, right? Beijing always thinks it can kind of get a reset with a new American president. It can sort of take things anew. And post-Trump, I think they thought, you know, let's reset this. Let's start this again. Everyone thought Trump was crazy. Let's see if we can persuade the Americans that we need to work together on trade, on North Korea, on Afghanistan, on all kinds of other things. And let's see if we can leverage that into some kind of de-escalation on the other stuff. No, you know, we have a clear line that strategic competition with China is going to be a kind of organizing principle of this administration's policy in Asia. What that means in practice is, you know, is debatable, but certainly the way I see it, it reflects a sense that the Trump administration got it right on the need to compete with China and the framing of China as a systemic, long-term, severe rival and competitor. But what was needed was a kind of more broad and systemic view of that competition. So not just sending naval vessels to the Pacific to conduct freedom of navigation operations, not just military shows of force, occasionally sending 3 carrier groups into the Pacific and saying, look, you know, we can project this level of naval force. It's across the board competition. So rebuilding ties and trust with Japan, South Korea, Australia, rebuilding ties and investing in relationships with people, with groups like ASEAN and Indonesia, and, you know, not just the sort of big military allies, working on trade policy and filling in the kind of economic vacuums that were created by the Trump administration's withdrawal from the big Pacific economic deals. So, in other words, I see an administration that is willing, absolutely willing, to kind of say, we're going to walk and chew gum. We are going to tweak Beijing's nose if we think it's necessary. We'll call the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang genocide, and we will not blink about it. We will do that, and we will call China out as a rival, but we will still engage with it in pragmatic ways where we can. But that's not going to stop us from building up our military capabilities in Asia, building up our economic relationships, and competing for influence right across the Indo-Pacific, where it's required. And that, I think, is the noises I'm seeing straight out of the gate.
I think spot on. I think that's exactly what how I would interpret it as well. But I guess the question that raises is, if you see China-EU relations in the last 6 to 12 months and how they've evolved, if you see the emergence of the RACP agreement, who dropped out, who jumped in, I think being separate, it is a substantial show of force in terms of diplomatic and trade diplomacy capability.
Absolutely. This is the big black hole in American diplomacy, right? There was a good piece by James Crabtree, who's going to take over as the head of IISS Asia shortly, and probably a mutual friend of ours. But he wrote a piece in Foreign Policy yesterday where he said there is a tension in Biden-Land's foreign policy, which is you have an administration that is saying we'll compete with China, and it starts with people who are serious about competing with China, sitting on top of a group of people, a DoD and state, who hunger for this, who I think have been waiting to find an administration that will take that seriously, at the same time as saying we will have a foreign policy for the middle class, which of course is in American, that is euphemism and code for we will, for protectionism, for kind of cautious trade policy, not jumping back into big multilateral trade agreements. The mood in Congress is not right for trade agreements. And so, what do you have in that case? Either you accept that China is going to dominate the ground on these big multilateral economic agreements, which are of course also not just free trade agreements, they're standard setting agreements, right? That's the nature of modern trade and services agreements. They don't just open borders and let you flow goods and services. They lay down standards according to the preferences and attitudes of the states that lead them. And similarly, in the American case, this is a dilemma. How far is he willing to sort of alienate and irritate domestic audiences, domestic constituencies, to kind of grab and seize that economic leadership in Asia? I don't think we have the answer to that yet.
Well, I think Shashank, I think we might have the answer on a couple of things, right? There's no chance. Again, this is a question because I'm asking because you're the expert. Is there any? Let me reframe the question in a question format. Is there any chance of resurrecting any version of the TPP given domestic U.S. politics, and forget about the Republicans, the domestic compulsions of the Democratic Party as it stands on issues like TPP?
Well, Sharaf, these days I do guns, bombs, and missiles, so I'm the wrong person to ask on trade policy. But my amateur reading, and let me stress it is an amateur reading, it's very, very hard to imagine how you get there. They'll have to find some other way to do it. Maybe that is leadership on technology issues, on standard setting for 5G and technologies like that, for supply chain security, collaboration on green energy and clean technology. There are other ways in which to kind of advance that mantle of economic leadership, which I, as a security person, tend not to understand terribly well, or at least as well as I should. But in terms of a large-scale resurrection of TPP, that seems a tall order to me. But I could be wrong. What do you think?
No, I don't see it coming back. Just having, we had Matt Duss and Jonah Blank and Robin.
And Matt, of course, now entering the administration, I think, right?
Exactly. So he was with us just a few days after the election, and we were talking about kind of what it means to have AOC and other members of the Democratic Party that are quite clearly not only sort of aligned left, if you will, if not left-leaning, but who are also, in a sense, more populist and therefore capable of insurrection within the Democratic establishment. Interestingly, Biden himself, you mentioned Jake Sullivan and others in terms of this kind of youth wave. There's I think a limit to how much of a grand coalition Biden can manage within the party before he starts breaking it. And so it seems to me it's unlikely that things like the TPP are going to be resurrected. I think, like you, in fact, much more so than you, I'm not qualified on either TPP or these security issues. But I guess the question that leads to then, Mr. Joshi, is that we have a situation in which China clearly does not have the same nuclear, the same weapons and military hardware and footprint capability that the United States does. And yet China seems to be outgunning the US on, let's say, trade diplomacy, for lack of a better term. Isn't there a chance that people in Beijing will be sitting there and thinking, why don't we just keep stitching up greater interoperability and interdependence in the economies of Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore? Let them make statements about things that concern more us than them once in a while, but let's keep shoring up their markets and our market as interdependent. And if they want to keep sending ships into the, into the Indian Ocean, and if, they want to give people in New Delhi and Tokyo and Canberra a chance to get together, every few months, because actually that's not really the game China's playing.
This is a really interesting point, and I've been influenced on this by some of the things written by Evan Feigenbaum, who's the vice president of the Carnegie Endowment in Washington, and he has a phrase. I'll just read to you. I'm pulled it up on my screen now. He said, the US is disproportionately overweighted as a security provider, but underweighted on literally everything else. And he said the US risks becoming the Hessians of Asia, which is a sort of, reference to kind of a mercenary force, a military force that all except Beijing rely upon, but whose economic involvement grows in absolute terms while receding in relative terms. So, I mean, I completely share that view. I think that's a really astute point. Let me just say one thing and cycle back to the military point, which is something I maybe know a little bit more about than the trades aspect, which is that I wouldn't underestimate China's capacity there as well, right? Every year, the Department of Defense in the US releases an annual report on Chinese military power. And the last report that we have was striking, really striking. And I don't think people can sort of mentally accept this, but it said China has reached parity or exceeded the US in 3 areas. And I think it said it was shipbuilding, it was air defense, missile, anti-air capabilities, and conventional missiles. These are profoundly important areas. China now has the world's largest navy. I wrote a piece on the Coast Guard the other day. It has the world's largest Coast Guard cutter, I think, huge Coast Guard. On the naval side, it has some of the world's most sophisticated destroyers. It has a conventional missile arsenal that rivals the US, and of course the big advantage it has amidst all of this is that it can concentrate its military forces in the Western Pacific, whereas America has to distribute these across the entire world. It has treaty allies in Europe. It has partners and interests in the Middle East. It has a stake in the Indian Ocean, in the Western Pacific. It has to spread these forces, which have been stretched and strained after 20 years of, let's be honest, pretty much fruitless war in Asia and the Middle East for the last 20 years or so, whereas China has conserved its strength, modernized, studied American weaknesses. And if people are interested, I wrote a long piece on Taiwan, which explains the military balance around the island of Taiwan. And, it looks pretty grim for the United States. They could still potentially prevail, but at the cost of losing aircraft carriers, ships, huge costs, the likes of which have not been borne since the Korean War 60 plus years ago. I've written pieces on Chinese modernization, looking at how their training has been overhauled. This is not, people say the Chinese haven't fought a war for 30 years since Vietnam. Well, that may be true, but fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan is not the same thing as knowing how to fight in the Pacific in a state-on-state conflict. So I guess all I'm saying here is that don't underestimate China. It's a growing and impressive military power, one that has really understood how to deny America access to the Pacific.
So that, I think, then even further, in a sense, consolidates or buttresses the kind of next question that I had, which is really around if we concede that China has superior diplomatic, economic diplomacy capability as of right now, demonstrably, and we accept the contention that China must not be underestimated in terms of its hardware and footprint capability from a military and security perspective, then the question is, is the Biden administration's approach, which is kind of, you said walk and chew gum at the same time. How much does it risk walking in chewing gum? Is the Quad, for example, anything more? The Quad is presented as a strategic kind of response to China's presence in the ocean. Is that a strategic response, or is it a tactical one? Because strategically, the things that would inform that response, economic heft, RECP, what have you, and capability, on both those fronts, we've just, sort of agreed that China should not be underestimated. Talk us through a little bit as to what the leaning into the Quad might mean for the Biden version of the U.S.-China competition.
Maybe we should say what the Quad is, because not everyone may be as steeped in the minutiae of these little groupings as
I'm just pretending we're in one of the airport lounges that we've occasionally.
So the Quad is a informal grouping. The Quad is not a title they use themselves. It was once the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, a grouping of the U.S., Japan, India, and Australia, and it has its genesis in, I think, the idea of a security diamond that Shinzo Abe came up with when he was prime minister a long time ago. They met in 2007. They conducted huge big naval exercises in the Malabar exercise series together. China went crazy. Australia backed out. India also got a little bit, slightly cold feet, and they didn't meet for a while. And then post-2010, what happens is China's behavior in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, its general, competition with these countries and attitude towards these countries basically changes perceptions of China, as we all know. Everyone gets spooked by China. And so the Quad begins meeting again. And not only do they meet again, but they start meeting at ministerial level again, which is, in the little tea leaf reading of these things is a big deal to get senior ministers meeting at this level. It's no small thing. At the same time, last year, or this year rather, 2020, the Malabar exercise, India allows Australia back into the exercise. So the Malabar naval exercise, for the first time in a long time, is coterminous with the membership of the Quad. Now, look, the Quad is not a military alliance. There's no security guarantees. It's very informal. And I would say that its value is not just in bringing together four of these substantial regional powers. It's also that they themselves don't want to over-militarize it. If you look at what the Quad's been doing and what they emphasized in the past year, let me give you a couple of examples. They conducted a counterterrorism tabletop exercise I think it was in Mumbai, which is no big deal, but of course, it's an excuse for intelligence officers from these countries to get together and chat over something like terrorism, which is always a nice innocuous way to get to talk to people on a sort of uncontroversial subject without mentioning China. During the COVID pandemic, they talked about economic recovery post-COVID. And that's interesting because I think it shows you they themselves they're aware of the risk, I think, that you were hinting at, which is that you're kind of coming up with a militarized response to what is a strategic, political, military, economic, and diplomatic problem. And I think they know that. I think they're fully aware of that. We know India is acutely sensitive to any suggestion it's entering into an alliance with the US or a kind of military grouping in the Quad. It doesn't want it to be seen as that, even though there is a military and security element. There are naval exercises, there are sort of there's a military dialogue, but they want this to be seen as a broad dialogue that includes, if we look at the readouts, it includes, I think, non-proliferation has been discussed, actually, which in Japan's case means North Korea. Please discuss, please, India, let's talk about North Korea. They mentioned technology supply chains, which in the Indian American context means, please talk about Huawei without mentioning Huawei. Let's talk about supply chains. So I think they're aware of this, and they see it as a kind of vehicle in which many of these issues, economic, technological, diplomatic, responses to the Belt and Road Initiative, of course, being a very, very important one. Sustainable development financing.
There's also some pressure. I mean, I've seen noises around Myanmar and kind of
Right,
democracy.
exactly. Now, of course, on Myanmar, as we know, there are very, very complicated judgments here. India has a very specific interests and has been very cautious about how it handles Myanmar. The US on a human rights front is clearly going to be much more gung-ho, I think, under this administration. So, Myanmar is probably not going to be the area where they find consensus. But the fact that they are discussing it, the fact that they are talking about it, it's on the agenda, I think shows you they want to have a really broad agenda. And look, I'll put my cards on the table, as someone worried about the rise of China and its implications for kind of open societies in Asia, but worldwide, I think that's a good thing. I'm glad that the US, India, Japan, and Australia are doing this, getting together. I don't anticipate that they're going to be sailing big armadas in the first island chain deterring the PLA Navy, but I'm glad that this is one among many vehicles. And I think that's the other thing to remember, that the mood is, let's have multiple groupings. There's not going to be just one. The Quad is going to sit next to ASEAN discussions. It'll sit next to the trilateral discussions. It'll sit next to all sorts of other things. And these will coexist and bubble. It's not going to be like Europe, where in the post-war era, we had a hub and spokes. Sorry, we had a kind of a true multilateral model like NATO, integrated, fully formalized, institutionalized. In the US, we had a hub in Asia. We had a hub and spokes model, all roads leading to the US, and now we have something kind of much more messy, much more fragmented, but much more loose and fluid that is also more flexible.
Is it also more dangerous because it's more flexible?
It's dangerous. Why do you think it's dangerous?
Well, from any number of perspectives, this is, sort of networks off networks, essentially, right? I mean, one thing that your description of the Quad reminded me of, I'll put my cards on the table. I think the China threat is, stated in a manner that far exceeds the kind of malevolent intent that I think a lot of Western voices attribute to China. Isn't really there as a driver of economic growth, both in its immediate neighborhood, but way beyond that. There's for example, I thought while you were talking about the Quad, all I could think about was, I wonder what India's role in the SCO is going to be as a result of this dynamic, especially given India's constraints, self-imposed, right? And I think that the thinking in Moscow and Beijing was very much that, the drawing in of Pakistan and India to the SCO would allow for the establishment of a new layer, a different one than the one perhaps in 98, 99, 2000, when both capitals look to the United States, when they look to Washington, where Bill Clinton had to intervene personally, and that effort, in a sense, the Quad, much more than competing with China per se, the Quad represents a collectivization of one worldview, whereas perhaps the SCO might represent a different kind. And as of right now, I'd love to hear your view on where it's gotten to, whether the inclusion of India and Pakistan into the SCO has done what perhaps Moscow and Beijing wanted it to do, or whether not. What is your reading of that? Is that a decent juxtaposition in your mind?
For me, they operate on sort of different levels, and I'm much more skeptical about the substance and the long-term momentum of that wider SCO, the sort of expanded SCO. The SCO is very important to Beijing and Moscow, but particularly to Beijing. But I think India is hedging its bets, right? We know it's hedging its bets in the last year, particularly in the Trump years, when US leadership was so erratic and uncertain and no one knew where it was going. Of course, India was saying, well, we're not going to sort of burn our bridges with Russia. We're going to actually cultivate these to some extent. And India likes having a foot in different camps. It likes hedging its bets. And we see this. But ultimately, I think it's hedging to different degrees. I think the way in which India has accepted an atrophy in the India-Russia relationship in the last 10 years. I think its revealed preferences are that, of course, we want to kind of keep a tie to Russia, strategic weaponry for Russia's on the P5. It makes a big difference in these big diplomatic discussions. It's still it's not completely absent in Afghanistan. We don't want, and nor do we want to push it too far to China. That's a big concern, a criticism they have of Europeans, right? You have pushed Russia into China's arms, you Europeans, and so India wants to avoid that. But at the end of the day, is it a serious constraint on the U.S.-India relationship? No. I would say in 10 years' time, we're going to be looking, and maybe we can put this down and revisit this in 5 or 10 years. I think we're going to be looking at a much more frayed, atrophied India-Russia relationship, and a much stronger US-India one in ways that will reveal that preference over time. And I think the fact is we have to take into account the India-China relationship is I don't want to say bruised. It's shattered, right? After 2017 in the Doklam crisis, and then after this last year's Ladakh crisis, which is only just being resolved. Let's not kid ourselves. Resolution does not mean kind of settlement of the issues. That trust is evaporated. It's gone. And I think that the Russia-China relationship becoming ever closer is also going to be something that India sees as a kind of inevitability.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not even sure the Ladakh crisis is, as you said, kind of, being resolved. Shashank Singh, who I think, for my money is the safest pair of hands on these issues, has written a brilliant piece. I think it was, in fact, yesterday, that describes that this is really only a quarter of kind of the wider set of, incursions or exchanges that the Chinese and the Indians had. I like that we've segued into Russia. That was exactly the intent, and I think it's interesting because when we talk about Russia, it's like Russian agency is almost neglected in the conversation. So to the extent that the Indians have an idea of what they want with Russia, I mean, the S-400, and now, the kind of sales pitch that I think Russia's engaged in on the Su-57. Again, you're the expert, but
yeah, I mean, they have aspirations.
Sure. But what I found interesting in the State of the Union that Lavrov did right after the New Year, I think, I don't know if you caught any of that, but in a kind of 2.5-hour presentation, he spent something upwards of 12 minutes on just India. There was just a whole stretch. And I found it fascinating how nuanced and careful Lavrov was. Now, Lavrov is an expert sort of diplomat, as good as they come, for my money. And so it was very, very peculiar and interesting, the manner in which he almost protected India as he described various efforts that are U.S. aligned. And I think the Quad was one of them, but there were several others. I guess your prediction about the future of India-Russia relations assumes, and correct me if I'm wrong, but does it assume that Russia, or maybe does it not invest enough agency in what Russia wants? Because it seems to me that Russia is not going to let New Delhi go as easily. And believe me, I'm sitting in a capital where, certainly there's an appetite to see increasingly frayed India-Russia relations. But the delivery of the S-400 and Lavrov's behavior and several other economic and historical factors would suggest that actually it isn't going to fray that much.
So I think that you're right that the Russians are kind of solicitous of India, and they're aware of the importance of also cultivating that relationship, particularly in a period in which Russia's is deepening its involvement in Asia in some respects over the last 5 or 6 years, in a period in which the Russia-West relationship has so comprehensively broken down. That increases the importance of this kind of diplomacy with India and other states. But on the flip side, let's take the example of Afghanistan, which is a very important issue for India in ways that we understand, I think, and is an important issue for Russia, but not quite as important. Look at the noises they've been making about the Taliban, right? The Russia-India divergence on the future of Afghanistan and the role of the Taliban is quite striking and quite stark. Look at the role of Russia-China cooperation. You have Russia now cooperating with China on early warning systems, early warning radar systems for kind of nuclear attack, in ways that I think India will be watching and will be mindful of. They're not ignorant of this stuff. So I think that you're right. Of course, there is still there's a willingness not to let that relationship kind of deteriorate or kind of ebb away. But I think when it comes to the active substance, who is it that India is discussing, sustainable, counter BRI efforts with? Who is it discussing, technology supply chains with? Who is it discussing future military technology with, including, aircraft carriers and carrier launching systems? It's not Russia. Now, maybe those who have a sort of deeper understanding of the India-Russia relationship than me can sort of say why I'm wrong and why India feels it can juggle all of these balls at once and keep them going. But I think that if you're looking from a Russian point of view, the Russia-China relationship is more pivotal and more substantial and more momentous for your future of your economy and your sort of diplomacy than the Russia-India relationship is. And that will be, I think, that will guide the choices they make and the priorities they make. And by the way, I don't think that's because of European sanctions or American pressure. I think that just reflects kind of underlying Russian preferences, and Russia can see the trends as well as we can.
So that, going back to the challenge for Biden, I mean, this was a really interesting, and I think it speaks to maybe the shifting center of gravity of these conversations, because, I mean, we just spent a substantial amount of time essentially talking about Asia and the extent Eurasia, but the Euro part was minimal. Yeah. I think that's a mistake, at least from the Biden administration's perspective, because I was struck by how central NATO seemed to be in the initial signaling from the administration. Certainly much more, I mean, a dramatic shift from what we've seen.
Absolutely.
Talk a little bit, Shashank, about the challenge that the U.S. faces in kind of revitalizing NATO with a cash crunch and a post-COVID sort of, recovery situation, not just for the U.S., but for all of Europe, but also for the kind of shifting politics within Europe. The extent to which NATO and other U.S. allies in Europe can reasonably expect to mount some sort of a challenge to the kind of innate strengths that Russia has on that frontier.
Yeah, so it's a good time to discuss this because, of course, NATO is meeting now as we speak at the sort of senior level to discuss the future of its Afghan operations and the Resolute Support mission there, but also, the first post-Biden big NATO meeting. And it's a kind of moment of catharsis after 4 years of being abused and criticized. The easy bit is reaffirming Article 5, reaffirming the value of the relationship. The much harder bit is understanding, okay, what about the future of the U.S. posture in Europe? Biden reversed the Trump move to pull troops out of Germany, but will Biden want to keep the American footprint in Europe continuous as it is now, or will he want to see a substantive reallocation of forces further east? The bigger question in my mind is, how does this all play in with European debate about what I say we, I'm sitting here now, of course, on an island that has masochistically ripped itself apart from its biggest trading partner and is floating adrift in Britain, but in the European Union, a debate that is increasingly about European autonomy, or as Emmanuel Macron calls it, strategic European sovereignty or strategic autonomy. And the idea, of course, is that this is not just about the Trump years. Yes, the Trump period sparked that debate. How do we as Europeans protect our interests on technology, on data, but also on defense? How do we look after ourselves more if the US isn't going to be around and willing to help? And that isn't just about the Trump years. They're very, very clear now that this will outlast the Trump years. This is about the longer-term direction of U.S. movement. And the Biden administration can take this in two ways. It can say...
Before you go into the Biden administration, Shashank, how much of it is also about Europe's perceptions about its relationship with China?
I think part of it is it's about saying we will have an independent approach to China. We're not going to be just go along with whatever the US tells us to. And we saw that, of course, in the thing you alluded to, the investment agreement that was signed by the EU in China, which made the Biden administration, irritated. They said, why didn't you wait for us and to consult us on this? Because this has such big geoeconomic ramifications for the way you have effectively, allowed China access to your market and given a green light to its labor practices at home. So they're saying, yes, this part of this is we're going to go our own way on China. We're not going to be. We also think China is a systemic rival. That's the phrase that Macron, I think, in the EU uses. But we're not going to interpret that and act on it in the same way that you Americans do. You have treaty allies in Asia. We don't. You're willing to kind of decouple, technology supply chains where maybe not so much. So there's big differences. But China's just one part of it. It's also about Russia. It's also about North Africa. It's also about, US tech companies and how far the European Union wants to kind of regulate them and stamp its own authority on these things. And this creates inevitable tension, because the tension is this. Europeans want strategic autonomy. They want to sort of carve out an independent role for themselves and freedom of action for themselves. But, they still depend on the US for protection. You still have, I can't cite all the figures now, but US spending in NATO is still a huge chunk of the total. European armies are still, hollowed out from years of cuts and post-Cold War, divestment, only slowly rebuilding themselves. Germany, the biggest economy, still doesn't spend 2% of GDP on defense. Now Britain is out of the EU, so you have this even more difficult situation where kind of France is the biggest real military power left in the EU. So how do you handle all of this? Well, the challenge, one way the Biden administration could handle it is to say, okay, you want autonomy? You have autonomy. Go for it. You take over you look after North Africa. You look after the Sahel. You send troops in there. You look after Estonia. We'll still keep a presence in Germany. We'll still keep NATO. We'll still protect you. And, we still value the integrity and security of Europe. But we're not gonna sit there and, give you billions to reinforce airfields in the Czech Republic like we did in the Obama and Trump years. We have that money to spend in the Philippines and in Singapore and in Japan. That's where bang for buck really matters. That's one way it may go. And I suspect a lot of this will depend on the kind of EU-US diplomacy, but also Russia's posture and how the US interprets the Russia threat, which I think in many ways will be seen more of as kind of an information threat, a cyber threat, than a purely military one. So in other words, I guess I still see a continuation of many of the trends that we've seen of the Trump years, which is a more autonomous, a more independent Europe. I'm sorry, I rambled there for too long.
No, not at all. This has been so enriching for me, Shashank. Thanks for making time to do this. We're coming up on the hour, and I think, in the interest of your diary, because I'm certainly game to go on for much longer. But I guess, everything that we've talked about suggests that now that maybe some of us are over the euphoria of essentially a Trump defeat, and I think to the extent that, people are excited about Biden because of the kind of human being that, he seems to be, the life experiences.
Not a terrible human being, you mean. It's a nice change.
Which is like, finally, right? Like, we've had a pretty bad run globally. And I think that, but I guess the question is, if you kind of park that euphoria for a second, almost on every topic that we've touched on today, the nature of threat or challenge doesn't change just because, Biden beat Trump out by a whisker, which kind of makes sense. Why would it? And therefore, a lot of the optimism based on, the quality of people or the worldview that Biden brings to the table actually doesn't maybe matter as much. I hate to end on a negative note, but what I'll draw from this conversation, and I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, is I think to the extent that we like, people in the Biden administration and we like Biden, it's great. But the fundamental core challenges, China's vast expansion of capability on all fronts, Russia's continued path on the trajectory that it's on, the hollowing out of European power and strength, particularly as manifest in Brexit, which really is an indictment also of the European project, at least sitting from here. It's not just an indictment of Nigel Farage, right? And so you put all that together, and you consider that U.S. capability, especially diplomatic and economic capability, has taken a massive beating over the last decade and a half, 4 years, or whatever you want to call it. What remains for you and I to be hopeful that some of these challenges are going to be dealt with the compassion and the healing touch that President Biden talked about when he first took over? This is a world that needs healing, no?
Yeah, well, I think you're right. Those challenges are sort of, those challenges are unchanged. I would, North Korea is a good example of that, right? The options that Biden faces for North Korea are no better than the ones that Trump faced. Trump made a brash, dramatic approach to the issue, charged in and failed, but he at least tried. And he tried to sort of approach the problem in a new way. And the North Korean nuclear program is large, substantial, it's grown, it's consolidated. Biden has to make some very difficult choices about accepting its continued growth under sanctions forever, or, swallowing some poison, accepting some compromises and trying to freeze that program. And all of it is going to result in a sort of shitstorm either way. Whichever option he goes, he's going to face enormous fallout. But look, let's try and end on a more optimistic note. And let me offer just two things to begin with. Well, three things, right? Okay. First of all, human rights. I'm not going to pretend the U.S. has ever been or will suddenly be a country that human rights is the only criteria of policy. Of course, that's not the case. But it will become a country in which, if the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia chops up a journalist, then maybe the president will say something about it, and maybe something will happen, rather than just denial. So I'm that's not the be all and end all of human rights, but I suspect that will change. Did you want to go in?
Yeah, just that. I mean, even there isn't the challenge that it'll be easy to talk down to maybe the target you mentioned and several others. Certainly China, you've already mentioned. It might be harder to do that with Poland. Might be harder to do that with India.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right, and it's always been as such, hasn't it? Right, talking to big important allies in tough ways about human rights records is always far tougher than talking to smaller ones. But look, Saudi Arabia is not a small fish. It's an important counterterrorism partner of the US. That sort of thing has costs as well. But I suspect you will still see more difficult conversations with even those important partners, right? Whether that translates into fundamental changes in their behavior, I maybe not. And that's maybe a whole separate conversation. But it will be raised, it will come up, it will be discussed. It will matter again. And I do think that makes a difference. I think that an autocrat who is deciding, do I kidnap this dissident in a third country and kind of pull him back? They'll have to reckon with that prospect of, what will Congress say now, and what will the State Department say? What will, at the next hearing, they're going to be the undersecretary of such and such going to be asked about this, and I'm going to be embarrassed when they come and they say this, or when the director of national intelligence says that my agency was involved in killing a dissident in some European country. That's going to happen. So I see that as grounds of optimism. The second thing is JCPOA. Look, an arms control. Arms control was shredded under the Trump years. The JCPOA was a solid, significant deal that was ripped apart. Similarly, the INF Treaty was abandoned. Okay, Russia was cheating, but could have been fixed. The Open Skies Treaty has been abandoned, which is a big European agreement that allows surveillance flights. Arms control is in really bad shape amongst the US and Russia. Biden, in one of his first moves, renewed the New START Treaty, which means it's the only remaining cap on these massive arsenals of the US and Russia. This is good news for all of us. It's great news. And this is building paving the ground for other types of arms control on new technologies, whether that's kind of hypersonic gliders or underwater nuclear torpedoes of the kind that Russia is building. Arms control is back. And one hopes that it can slowly be extended. I would, of course, like to see arms control type or at least confidence-building discussions take place between other nuclear powers. And that includes US and China, and that includes India, Pakistan, and others as well. But arms control will be back into the conversation in a new way. And the third thing I would leave you on is climate change, which is something we haven't touched on and discussed, and something I don't know very much about. I'm a defense correspondent and I write about defense and security issues, but the Biden administration has said it will treat climate change as a national security issue. Now, you can be cynical about that and say, well, of course they would say that, but it means that, the machinery of DoD, of the intelligence community, of these big bureaucracies is whirring up and thinking about not only what does climate change mean for us in the Arctic, in the Sahel, in South America, in terms of creating conflict, driving resource competition, and creating military issues that will cause problems for us, but also, when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs meets the Indian or Pakistani defense chief, or he meets the NATO Secretary General, climate change and its consequences may be on the agenda, and that is just the beginning. We have a big climate change summit coming up, but the fact that we have a president who doesn't deny the reality of this, and a group of leaders now who, whatever their ideological differences and human rights records, tend to have some overlapping grounds of reality on this, I think is good news. So if you wanted me to pull it back to some mildly optimistic news, I thought I would end on that point.
Expertly done, Shashank. Always such a pleasure and such an enlightening experience to get to hear you dish wisdom. Thanks for doing this with us, and come back again real soon. I'm sure that we'll have much reason to, unfortunately, but at least we get to catch up like this. This has been a fantastic conversation for me. I hope it was for those that are watching. Thank you, Shashank Joshi, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, again soon at the Tabadlab.